Orphie Magus, who we'll call Orphie for short, are about to drop. Technically, they're two individuals but one character, being the latest fire attack agent in ZZZ. Not like that's anything new, this is a role element combo that we've got multiple units for already, but the niche she fills is pretty distinct. This is because instead of being a greedy on-fielder who takes a main DPS role, Orphie's more of a secondary damage unit with a lot of buff potential, shining brightest when running teams with multiple attackers. Orphie focuses on aftershocks, both in the way you might expect her to be, coming into the field to attack while you pilot another unit, and in the way SAnby is, with many of her attacks being considered aftershocks even when she's the active character, which means that she can be played in multiple ways. Depending on who you run her with, different approaches to how often and how long to swap to her can change dramatically. Before that, let's go through the basics of her kit. Being an aftershock character, if she's off field, Orphie will use her special when an ally attacks, with a 5-second cooldown. If she's off field with more than 60 energy, she'll use her EX special instead. It only consumes 30 energy, but it won't happen unless she's over 60. Regardless of if it's a special or an EX special, Orphie will build 20 Bottled Heat, her unique resource, with a cap of 125, which is tracked by the bar underneath her portrait. Bottled Heat generation isn't hard capped by the 5-second aftershock cooldown, as if you swap to Orphie, pressing her special button with more than 30 energy will use her standard EX special. And this will also build 20 Bottled Heat, and unlike her aftershock, doesn't need her to be over 60 energy, just 30 energy cost whenever. It doesn't even need to hit enemies to generate Bottled Heat, so it can be used during invulnerability phases if needed. Pressing basic attack after hardcast EX will follow up with a 5th hit of her basic attack and a Fireblade, which isn't all that strong, but can be useful at building up energy, so don't write it off. Just be wary as, unlike most of her other moves, it has no invulnerability. Orphie's chain attack and ultimate will also build up 20 Bottled Heat. Her chain attack is quite slow with very long recovery frames, but it does allow you to swap out of it very early on, so it usually isn't an issue. And it triggers other chains rather quickly, so it's good to slot in if time allows. Her ultimate is very similar to Benice's, where it will bring up a quick assist prompt very early on, and going through with it will extend the duration of the attack. This means it takes up barely any time at all and works really well both in and out of stun. If the Bottled Heat gauge is at 100 or more, being on Orphie and holding down the special button will activate an alternate EX special, Heat Charge, a continuous beam that consumes Bottled Heat and gives a quick assist prompt. It's also a parry, in the same way Yanagi's special or Ishuan's EX is, and if it blocks an attack, it will skip its startup and activate instantly. What makes this attack strong though is that it bestows the whole team with a buff, called Zeroed In, and this buff is pretty darn important, because although Orphie is an attacker, she feels like a support instead. The specifics of what this buff does are covered by her core passive and additional ability, which activates on stun and support agents. But to summarize, you get up to 700 combat attack from her core, scaling with Orphie's energy regen stat, and 25% death ignore on all aftershocks done by the team from her additional. I should add that all of Orphie's attacks, with the exception of dodge counters and assists, are considered aftershocks for damage purposes, even if they're being done with her as the active character. The base duration of the buff is 12 seconds, which is pretty low. Even with a full energy regen build, it's difficult to maintain uptime of this. Thankfully, every aftershock triggered will extend the duration of the buff by 4 seconds, with a maximum extension of 20 seconds. That's not a maximum duration of 20 seconds, it's a maximum extension, so the buff can last for up to 32 seconds if refreshed. The catch is, aftershocks only extend the buff for the agent that used it, so if Orphie does an aftershock, her own buff duration extends, but her allies, like Seed, get nothing. There's a little more to her core, namely a flat 25% crit rate bonus and an 85% damage bonus to aftershocks, active at all times for Orphie alone. That's about it for Orphie basics. But there is a lot more to how she plays. Like with all recent aftershock units, her aftershock is a heavy attack, which means it can trigger chains if you're not careful. However, the same is not true for her regular special aftershock. Her heat charge, the EX special hold beam, has a very high interrupt level, but it doesn't start straight away. It has a low power and a high power phase. It's the high power phase that interrupts enemies and that the parry shortcuts to. So be careful if you use a heat charge beam and swap out, because Orphie is likely to interrupt the enemy and mess with defensive assists and rotations. That's not necessarily a problem. I can think of a few bosses where having a readily available interrupt will go a long way. But be wary that transitioning from other skills to the heat charge beam can be risky, as it doesn't seem to have frame 1 invulnerability. So when going from, say, a dodge counter or an assist follow-up into it, Orphie can get hit midway through. It's also important to be aware of how the casting of the skill works. Since you need to hold EX for the heat charge beam, it's possible to chain it right after a standard EX if you time it right. Time it wrong though, and you use up the energy while barely getting any hits in, so don't mash before holding. At least if you do go into it before any hits connect with the enemy, you're safe, with no energy being used. Mastering the timing is particularly useful to learn when coupled with manual chain, since it allows you to get damage in, build bottled heat, and go straight to the heat charge beam right as stun begins. In some teams, like with Seed, it can line up perfectly with their attacks, leading to sleek, high-damaging combos. And you do want to use this as the stun begins. Most enemies have a 12-second stun duration, but this is extended due to stun recalcs, the pause that happens when an enemy is first stunned or a chain is triggered. So most enemies' stun duration ends up being closer to 15 seconds, longer than the 12-second base duration of the zeroed in buff. Luckily, the buff isn't applied on using the heat charge beam, but on it hitting an enemy. Since the beam takes a very long time to end, every hit refreshes the buff, making it last just about enough to cover a whole stun period. And I do mean it when I say it lasts a long time. The beam takes around 3 seconds, but it's then followed up with another attack, which itself takes around 3 seconds. That's 6 seconds total. And although it's treated as aftershock damage, it isn't an aftershock, so it completely locks you out of swapping to Orphie. This has caught me out time and time and time again. Since it's 6 seconds of uninterrupted animation, it also means that she isn't doing aftershocks, so you can overcap in energy if you're not careful. Not to mention potentially going 11 seconds without a single aftershock depending on timing. The same is true for her ultimate, which is almost 6 seconds of animation lock by itself. Chain, thankfully, is a lot shorter, more like 4 seconds instead of 6, but still something to be mindful of. You'd also think that since almost all her moves count as aftershock damage, it'd be fine to swap to her and burn energy by hard casting her EX. Except that the damage value on it is less than half that of her regular aftershock special. Never mind the Aftershock EX, which is more than 3 times stronger. It is still fine to use it though. Don't be fooled and think it's bad. Orphie will Aftershock regardless of energy, so in theory, a regular special Aftershock followed by a hard cast EX would be ever so slightly better in terms of raw damage. So long as you're getting as many Aftershocks as you can on cooldown, whether it's a hard cast or an Aftershock EX isn't that big a deal. All of this amounts to a playstyle where you want to spend a little time on Orphie, keeping her energy over 60 so she can use as many Aftershock EXs as possible, and swapping in only to refresh the zeroed in buff. If you're so inclined, swapping in after her special to hardcast EX can work too, so long as it's not taking up too much field time from other characters. When running her with SAnby, that's pretty easy. She has Aftershocks to extend the buff duration, and wants to on-field anyways to give Orphie bonuses from the Silver Star mark. As far as teams are concerned, Orphie really is a character tailor-made for SAnby, given that her buff extends with Aftershocks and the additional ability's Def Ignore only applies to Aftershock attacks. Technically, you could run Orphie as a main damage dealer with Lighter. It isn't coming close to Evelyn, but it's alright. The benefit of this is less to Orphie herself, but to Lighter, as she fulfills his additional ability. Kamano and Yadari are both Rupture units, so when they come, who knows, maybe Lighter Orphie could be a somewhat viable shell? Besides them, there isn't much value in Orphie for other teams. She can work as a pseudo-support of sorts, but there's no slot that she'd be used in that another actual support unit couldn't do better in. Astra and Yuzuha would be far better picks. Heck, even Nicole is likely the better option for most teams over Orphie. In fact, when building Orphie teams, you'd likely want to run them with each other. Even with a flat combat attack saturation, Astra and Orphie are still strong together, and Nicole's Death Shred will scale heavily with Orphie's additional ability and signature engine. Trigger should be the best general pick, being an Aftershock stunner and all, especially if using Spectral Gaze, as, similar to Nicole, the Death Shred synergy is strong. Trigger was already pumping damage before. Now, with Orphie to assist, Trigger's total contribution to a team is nothing to scoff at, especially when running Attack D6, which is common for fights like Defiler. And of course, Jufufu has similar benefits too, also being an Aftershock stunner. Since Orphie is an attacker, this means she is eligible for the Decibel refund, making rotations with another Rupture or attacker a lot smoother. Even still, Orphie isn't a particularly versatile character. Although she plays well with many supports and stunners, she is going to want another damage dealer. Unless you really believe in the Lighter Dream, that is. The issue is that for most teams, she won't be a better support than an actual support, and since she doesn't want to be the sole damage unit, the partner Orphie really shines with is SAnby, a comp where she is the best support. Don't let me downplay her though, she can certainly fit in a slot while still providing good buffs. There's nothing stopping you from running her with a character like Evelyn and do fine, it just won't be an optimal pairing. Seed is the one exception, being the character that actively wants to run another attacker. Since Orphie wants that too, you'd think they're made for each other. Except that when you think about it, Seed and Orphie have arguably more anti-synergy between them than almost any other comp. Everything you think you know about Orphie has to be flipped on its head. The first is one that applies to any attacker not named SAnby, the duration of 0 Den. Without any aftershocks to extend it, it's not possible to maintain full uptime. Even consistent uptime isn't going to happen if you're only building gauge via the 5-second cooldown on aftershocks. With 20 bottled heat per use, that's a minimum of 25 seconds between buffs. Realistically, it's a lot more, as aftershocks don't happen every 5 seconds. It's a 5-second cooldown. The rest is specific to Seed, however. With Orphie's EX all using up 30 energy, it's a real pain to get it to work with Seed combos. Because of the way steel charge breakpoints work, if you're at just about 120 steel charge, a combo with Chain and Ultimate is just under 90. Attackers with a 60 energy cost EX special supplement the remaining 30 points with 1 EX use. Orphie, with 30 energy, only provides 15 steel charge. This means she either needs to EX twice consecutively, which takes a fair bit, or Seed needs to go into combos with at least 135 steel charge. This makes building up steel charge prior to stun a pain, and I had issues with just about not having enough again and again and again. Routing is a lot tighter with Orphie as a result. It does help that Orphie is overflowing with energy, but that might be a problem in and of itself. Due to Seed's energy regen to Vanguards, you may find Orphie overcapping on energy as her heat charge beam, chain attack, and ultimates get in the way of aftershocks. Assuming she's using her signature and energy regen D6, that is. What this means is that you need frequent breaks from Seed's on-fielding to hard cast Orphie's EX, for bottled heat, for steel charge, and just general energy management. In fact, you will want to do that even without overcapping on energy, because, and I quote, when the Vanguard consumes energy as the active character, or when Seed consumes energy, for every 1 point of energy consumed, Seed recovers 0.5 points of steel charge. You know what that means? Yep, Orphie's aftershocks do not generate a crumb of steel charge for Seed, so no Vanguard benefit while Orphie is aftershocking away. And I do mean no Vanguard benefit literally, because, and I quote again, Onslaught, Direct Strike, and Besiege buffs can all take effect when the character is the current active character. So all of Orphie's aftershocks, be them regular specials or EXs, not only fail to generate steel charge for Seed, they also do not benefit from the 1000 attack, 30% crit damage, and 25% damage bonus that Seed gives with the Direct Strike and Besiege buffs. A regular aftershock into hard casting EX really does sound like the best option after all, since at least a hard cast benefits from Seed's buffs. You'd think Seed and Orphie would want to run together, but they sure don't seem to like working with each other. Even still, Orphie is by far Seed's best partner, far outperforming SAnby or any other attacker for that matter, doubly so when run alongside Trigger. For context, I got 50,500 on Defiler with the Fiery Assault buff on a Seed Trigger SAnby comp. With little effort and limited familiarity with Orphie, under the same circumstances, I was making 57,000. A near 7,000 increase in score from a single character change is pretty ridiculous. And don't forget that the higher the score is in Deadly Assault, the more damage you need to do for a given point. That much score difference should be just over 13.5 million damage, and that's without benefiting from the electric damage bonus from Fiery Assault. At lower score thresholds, it'd be almost 10,000 points in difference. And we're just getting started, because there are ways to bridge the synergy gap between Seed and Orphie. Remember how I mentioned that if you go into the heat charge beam before the hardcast EX connects, no energy is used up? This is pretty common in ZZZ. Hugo, for example, doesn't use energy before his EX connects either, which can be useful to reposition and get back attacks on Ultimate. Soldier 11 also doesn't use up any energy until her EX lands. The same is true for Elo. And many others. When it comes to Orphie, one of her aftershocks is an EX special. Like many of those who came before, it also does not consume any energy until she makes contact with the enemy. You may also be aware that when a character performs an aftershock animation, they are freely swappable too. Orphie's heat charge beam locks her from being swapped into until she has gone off field. But there's no limitation on swaps if the character is in an aftershock animation. With both of these concepts in mind, you might see what I'm getting at. Seed only gets steel charge from characters when they use energy as the active agent. And both Direct Strike and Besiege buffs also only apply to active agents. So what if you were to swap into Orphie just as her aftershock begins, before it connects with an enemy, like when the fire text comes up? You get the best of both worlds. Not only does energy for the EX aftershock get consumed after the swap, meaning it's done while Orphie is active and therefore generates steel charge, it also benefits from Seed's buffs, which is pretty darn good. In practice, this isn't as great as it sounds. Orphie can still struggle with bottled heat generation and energy management, so hardcasting EX is something you want to do, if only to have zeroed in up for Seed's downfalls. You also have no real control of when Orphie's aftershocks happen. If the enemy is attacking, you may end up with an unwanted parry, or it might happen midway through a CDX or a basic attack. Considering Seed's basic 4 has a 700% damage multiplier and generates well over 20 steel charge, you'd be a fool to interrupt the basic string late and give it up just above one of Orphie's aftershocks. But there is specific routing that can make use of this tech. Since the heat charge beam takes so long, it's guaranteed that Orphie will go into an aftershock after it's done, so with proper planning, it can be used as a way to reset timers and structure a run. As part of one of my runs, I could sometimes get it in for the stun, and since using the heat charge beam to refresh the buff is important, it could work as a reset point. Thankfully, Seed's combo lines up in such a way that, depending on the speed of your execution, it's possible to have Orphie's aftershocks will line up with a final hit of ultimate, which means a free swap as downfall begins and more instant damage. It's not something I was actively looking for in my runs out of stun, but something worth doing when the opportunity presents itself, so long as it's not sacrificing greater gains elsewhere. So despite not having much synergy, there's ways to get Seed and Orphie to work together, and even without this, they are incredibly strong. And I don't mean strong just in terms of buffs. Being a half attacker, half support means that you can't ignore Orphie's individual damage contribution to a team, which means you will want her to be built. I won't go through her weapon options in detail, there's other creators who have done much more rigorous testing on them than I have. Just know that Orphie's signature, Bellicose Blaze, is very strong. Alternatively, Heartstring Nocturne is more than fine. Orphie is a fire attacker after all, so the rest shred on chains and automates from it works in full. Free to play wise, the event Wenjins are always good, and barring that, any energy regen Wenjin would make the cut. Metanuki Morphosis on Orphie is technically not a meme. Given Orphie's high personal damage, you will almost always get more mileage out of running her with Shadow Harmony 4-piece than any supportive set, like Astral Voice. Astra can enable the set, allowing for a Moonlight Lullaby and Astral Voice combo, but it's very much dependent on buffs, enemies, and routing. With the current Deadly Assault buffs, assuming your Orphie is built and her rotation is well managed, she contributes more than enough to pull her own weight. So on a highly optimized run, with Astra, without Orphie shield buffs, and ideally on non-fire weak enemies, it may be best. Otherwise, it's a safer bet to stick with Shadow Harmony. As for 2-piece, don't forget that Orphie's buff scales with energy regen, so Moonlight Lullaby or Swing Jazz is pretty important. Without her Wenjin, even if running an energy regen 2-piece and a D6, she only gets 520 attack and buffs. And even with her Wenjin, assuming no energy regen 2-piece, you're going to be just over 50 attack off. So whether you've got signature or not, 2-piece energy regen is the safest pick. And an energy regen D6 is indeed the best choice for Orphie, and the one I'd recommend. But surprisingly, not the only one. Given that Orphie gets attack from energy regen, and you aren't really overcapping on it even with it as a D6, running attack percent on D6 doesn't make much sense. But you shouldn't discredit it yet. My Orphie with a 4-piece Shadow Harmony on a C team, with her buff active, would have a total attack of 5,127. With the exact same setup, but using an attack percent D6 instead, she gets 5,466 instead. That's 339 more attack for Orphie, at the cost of 180 attack for others. Technically, the collective attack increase is greater with energy regen. 180 for 2 units is 360, but the main damage dealing unit, Seed in this case, is only getting a 180 attack bonus, whereas Orphie is almost 340 worse off. Surprisingly, from my personal experience doing runs in Deadly Assault, I found that with her signature Wenjin, attack percent on Orphie was about even with energy regen and C teams. Heck, my best scores with the C-trigger Orphie team were with an attack percent D6. Granted, they weren't refined, but it still speaks volumes. With SAnby, it wasn't as comparable. I did find energy regen to be a bit better there, but by around 1,000 score or so. Considering the Deadly Assault buff on rotation is a strong aftershock shield, is it any wonder that giving Orphie a greater damage increase on a C team could result in better scores? When running Orphie with Seed, if you aren't managing Orphie well and making effective use of her hardcast EXs, you might even find yourself overcapping on energy, making attack competitive. Even as you get more involved with the character and integrate her into burst rotations, the damage gains you get from running an attack percent D6 and focusing on Orphie felt like it'd match, or depending on the rotation buffs, even outweigh the gains that energy regen would bring to Seed. Seed's passives provide more than enough energy generation, and I was still getting just as many uses of downfall anyways. But if you've really refined your rotations, where you can weave in hardcast EXs with Aftershock EXs, and can find ways to make use of the extra energy without sacrificing Aftershocks, then energy regen D6 would pull out ahead again. Assuming that you can maximize both Aftershock usage and resource generation, be it bottled heat or getting more downforce from steel charge gains, then the benefits from attack on Orphie isn't as big a deal. Or you're running Orphie or SAnby, in which case, the lack of free energy from Seed's passive, and the fact Aftershock shield buffs applied to SAnby too, meant that focusing most of the damage buffs on SAnby worked out marginally better. Would this still be the case on an electric neutral fire weak enemy though? I'm not sure. But what I'm trying to say is that if you've got Orphie's signature Wenjin, both energy regen and attack percent work as a d6, especially on C teams. Energy regen is likely the better choice, certainly for optimized runs, but it does ride on the team, enemy encounter, and available buffs, not to mention how your rotation flows and your level of skill. After all, who'd have thought that in a Seed SAnby Astra team, greater gains came from putting Seed on Astral Voice, not SAnby. Don't underestimate the sub-damage dealer's power. Without Bellicose Blaze though, energy regen d6 is a locked in. No excuses. Her d5 is another varied pick. Remember the 85% damage bonus to Aftershock from her core? Yeah, that's damage percent saturation, so fire damage bonus is losing a lot of value. But her core gives a flat combat attack buff, and since it's flat, not a percentage, it isn't scaling with any attack drive discs or substats, so that's a problem too, especially if you do use attack percent on d6. And with her getting 25% def ignore from her additional, as well as another 30% from her Wenjin, means Pen is objectively a terrible choice. Even without her Wenjin, 25% is so steep that it takes a very aggressive Shiyu or Deadly Assault buff to make Pen be better. I found Attack D5 to work better for me, at least with Energy Regen D6. This is backed up on paper as, in theory, it should pull out ahead unless Orphie is being run with other flat attack buffers, like Seed or Astra. Damage percent would be competitive in those cases, but with Seed's attack buff not applying to Orphie when she's inactive, as well as Deadly Assault buffs, like Chasing Blade, further saturating damage percent, it worked out better in my runs to stick with attack percent D5. I guess the one comp it'd be unquestionably optimal on are those of Lighter, so if that floats your boat, you know what to pick. D4 is the one straightforward pick. Using Bellicose Blaze or a crit rate main stat Wenjin alternative, run crit damage. Otherwise, crit rate. Before we close with some Deadly Assault showcases, let's talk skill priority. Core passive, naturally, takes precedence. It directly impacts Orphie's buff values, both through the base and total attack it can give, and by granting her more energy regen stats. Out of the skills, Special is the most important, with all of Orphie's Aftershocks, as well as her Heat Charge Beam, all falling under this category. Given the strength and utility of her ultimate, that's next, with Chain being a decent bonus as well. After that, I'd recommend Basic Attack, as the occasional shortcut to Basic 5 and Fireblade from hard-casting EX can be useful, but it's not particularly important. Then Assist for more damage and base. Dodge is unlikely to ever see frequent use, so it can stay at 1. With that, we've covered most of what you need to know for Orphie. I'll go through Mindscapes in detail in a future video, and if I find the time, do a few more Deadly Assault runs that are a little bit more polished. For now, let's have a sneak peek on how strong Orphie can be. Orphie has really grown on me. The more I played the character, the more enjoyable she became. Between the feeling of parrying with her heat charge beam, constant hot swapping, and the admittedly cool and dynamic look to her fireblades and EX Aftershock, she turned out to be ways away from a clumsy-looking passive sub-damage dealer that many pegged her as. There's a lot of optimization potential to capitalize on, and with her being what amounts to an Aftershock support, who knows, her team options might not stay limited for long. If you're interested in seeing how future characters and teams play out, want to learn more about fundamental game mechanics, or you're just into seeing niche tech, then do like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. I've got more videos coming. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.